All right. So look, so check it out. So you're teaching a class and the student says, this is some motherfucking stupid ass shit.
My initial response to that is like, that wouldn't happen in my classroom because I will have built the relationship with students so that those kinds of things don't happen in my classroom.
Peace, and welcome to another installment of Cook on Monday Morning. This is a especially important discussion for me because I'm talking to a family member, a man that I've known since I was 15. It's been 20 years. And throughout every area of my life, we've been connected through going to college and through the graduations, through the jobs, through the successes, through the failures, through the new loves and the breakups.
That's right.
It's been me and the homie Trevor Gardner. He was my 10th grade history teacher, and now he is
7th period. Stevon.
Was it 7th?
Oh, 7th period, man. I remember.
Now he is the dean of students at Arise High School, a beautiful school community in the Fruitvale neighborhood of Oakland. The author of 2 books, Discipline Over Punishment, and his latest release, Leading in the Belly of the Beast. I'm excited to get into this conversation with Trevor, but before I do, I'm going to read an excerpt from his first book. I begin every school year saying to my students, this year, you will teach me more than I could ever possibly teach you. They always laugh and dismiss my words, assuming I'm joking or trying to win them over with a compliment on day one. But each June, for nearly 20 years, I've reflected back and realized the truthfulness of this maxim. So much of what I know about teaching, about people, even about myself, I have learned from the young people and families I've had the privilege of teaching and being in community with for over 20 years. Welcome, Mr. Gardner. Welcome, Trevor.
Thank you, Stevon. I appreciate you reading that, man. Yeah, it's beautiful to be here. It's super special for me as well. And I feel, man, you give me all emotional. I feel really privileged to be here. And, that quote is perfect because being here talking to you was like, that's the embodiment of that quote, right? Like it's been true all along. And like the student becomes the teacher, right? And, I feel like I've been learning a lot from you all along, but this is just, a beautiful moment that's symbolic of that, right? The student becoming the teacher. So thank you for being my teacher all along.
Oh, man. I mean, you family, man. This is like, I've been learning from you. And, your career in education, I kind of want to dive into. I want to get into your upbringing. We were recording this at the start of right before the school year is about to start. Mm-hmm. And you're getting ready to launch classes virtually. So let's touch on that before we get into your backstory. How's it going? What's it looking like?
Man, well, it's multi-layered for me because I was just right before I came into this conversation consoling my son Omari, who is an 8th grader in OUSD, and we just got word this afternoon because OEA and OUSD have been in negotiations, and we just got word a few hours ago that they are going to start on August 10th, much to his chagrin. So, I'm operating as a father and a school leader as well. It is been a marathon. It's been a marathon all week because we were back on Monday with my staff and we've been working and grinding all week. And I am incredibly fortunate to work with this beautiful team of educators who are courageous and passionate and super committed. And still, it's overwhelming, right? And so they're overwhelmed every day. One, because the start of a school year is always a lot and it's always overwhelming. But you add the layer of literally having to build entirely new systems, entirely new structures and tools and ways of learning on top of just getting ready for the school year. And it really is, it's an incredible thing that teachers and educators are doing right now. And then planning on top of that, planning into the unknown, right? Like we went away in March, and we thought, in fact, I have this photo where my admin team, we literally wrote on the whiteboard, "What's your prediction of when we'll be back?" And it was like, "Oh, April 27th, May 17th, May this," right? Nobody said August. And here we are in August, and now we're like, well, maybe we meant 2021, right? And so that planning into the unknown is an extra layer of challenge that folks are dealing with.
Yeah.
Not to mention that a lot of them are educating and supporting their own children who are in school as well, or their young children who aren't in school yet. Yeah, man. Just mad respect to all the teachers and educators who are doing it right now.
Agreed. I haven't really talked about what my experience was like when you're talking about those dates of coming back, because I made the decision along with the board and superintendent to close schools. And we were in those closed session meetings with the leaders of the public health department, and I was talking to the mayor, right? Kind of here and there. We don't talk regularly, but this is a big decision, and it's a trip because I was one of those people. We initially closed schools for 2 weeks, and right before we closed schools, we were shutting down particular sites if people had what we thought were COVID symptoms, like if they were like a parent at Lowell had COVID, and so we shut down all of Lowell, right? And that's our biggest high school.
Yeah.
And so all the other high schools were like, why are we open? And so, yeah, I was on the side of I thought that we would be back at the start of May, and, now we're in August. And so it's a trip, man. It's a trip. I mean, with the work around restorative practices, right? Which is your first book. What does that mean now in a virtual setting?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's on some level, it's an incredible opportunity. So I've actually been, I did a summer book group with about 20 educators from around the country, focusing, it was after a seminar that I did on the book, and we were digging into that question. So on some level, I think right now is an incredible opportunity to reimagine, to dismantle, and to rebuild, because we don't have students in the building. Right. And so many of the issues related to school discipline that we deal with on the day-to-day and that often consume us, we are not encountering. Right. And so I think on some level, we have the space to do some of that redesign work to dismantle and rebuild. Right. And so this team of educators that I've been working with, who are in a dozen or so different schools, from teachers to school leaders, the question is, like, what is true about our discipline systems right now that we don't want to be true when we come back, whenever that is, and how are we using this moment to rebuild, to dismantle and rebuild. So let's look at our policies. Is your policy punitive? Is it entirely punitive? Okay, let's rewrite our policies, right? So that when we come back, there's a restorative component to our discipline policies. Let's look at our classroom practices. What are we prioritizing in our professional development, right? Are we prioritizing test prep? Are we prioritizing certain things that are Bettina Love uses this incredible term, spirit murdering. It's an incredibly powerful term, spirit murdering. So many of the things we do to students in schools, whether intentionally or unintentionally, results in this spirit murdering, right? And so are we prioritizing practices that have that impact on students? Or are we prioritizing practices in our professional development and what we ask our teachers and educators to do that are really restorative and transformative? So I think that's one thing, is that right now it's an opportunity to, when we are not so overwhelmed, because what happens is that school leaders, teachers are so overwhelmed with the day-to-day that it's rare that we get to step back and take the big picture perspective in order to be able to dream, to reimagine, to dismantle and to rebuild. So I think we have to use this moment to do some of that. And then the other thing I think is that we have to shift the energy that we put into some of these systems, of some of these discipline systems, into systems and structures of wellness in the moment, right? So let me give you an example. We were talking about at my school and a few of the schools of folks I was talking to, they have something like a student justice panel, right? Like a group of students who participate in the school culture and the discipline of the school. So we're talking about transforming and having those student leaders take on the role of sort of wellness, right? And so they're checking in on students who they know might be struggling, right? Creating different ways of tuning into students who might be disconnected, disengaged, who know as students, they know so much more than we do about what's going on with each other. So they're in tune with that, right? And so what role can they play in supporting each other's wellness? So I think those are a few things we can and need to be doing right now.
The emphasis on restorative practices, it kind of like picked up a lot of energy, maybe at least when I was paying attention to it, like maybe 10 years ago, maybe like 7 to 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. And it was a lot of goodwill around implementing in San Francisco as an alternative to suspension. And, you know, your book, Discipline Over Punishment, right, is like it speaks to this divide of or the disconnect on how the punitive approach isn't working and what a restorative approach will look like. But in the implementation of it across at least our district, it's like it's incredibly varied. I wanted to kind of get your impression on how it as an approach is taking hold across schools, like what's going well, what's not. And we should also just do a little ground setting, like what it is, you know, for people that just may not know. But like, let's take that first. Like, what is restorative practices, and then we can talk about how it's going.
Yeah, I mean, restorative justice, restorative practices, restorative discipline. There are several different terms that are used. I think at the most base level is a shift from a punitive approach that essentially is individualistic and approaches a wrongdoing or a harm on the part of a student with a punitive individualistic response. And what that looks like in schools is, you know, it's sort of crazy. It's what it's looked like in schools for forever, right? It is essentially the removal of students from the space of learning. So it might be getting kicked out of the classroom. It looks like suspension. It looks like detention, and ultimately it looks like expulsion. Right. So the response is you did something wrong, and so you're being removed from the space or you're being punished in a certain way. A restorative approach, which isn't just about schools, and I'm definitely not an expert in restorative justice in general. My entire experience with restorative justice comes from my experience as a teacher. And I hear you. You know, when I first wrote an article that became the book, essentially, was about 10 years ago, and I was like, you know, shooting in the dark, right? Like this is what I think is the right thing to do, and this is, I think, the right response to my classroom. And honestly, like I've been learning as I go. Oh, this thing is like there are frameworks and there are structures and there are systems that are called restorative justice. But I think at its root is basically this idea that we are a community, and so a harm done requires a response that respects all community members that are impacted, with the goal of transforming that transgression, transforming that behavior into something that changes for the individual, but also is healing for the community. Mm-hmm. So it's not about one-on-one, it's not about punishment, it's about ultimately both individual and community wellness, where there's definitely responsibility taking on the part of those who did harm or those who transgressed. But it is definitely not a removal from the community. And it requires an understanding that there's community impact for those transgressions that you had to take responsibility for.
Let's take it to like a few practical examples.
Yeah, so I think in schools, you know, again, like the detention suspension.
Oh, now I'm gonna give you a scenario. And then you're gonna tell me the restorative, the punitive and the restorative approach.
Quiz. You're getting back at me, huh? From all those tests I gave you.
All right. So look. So check it out. So you're teaching a class, and the student says, "This is some motherfucking stupid ass shit, bitch." That's not so uncommon to happen in a high school setting, but maybe it is, maybe it isn't. So what's the punitive approach? What's the restorative approach?
Well, I mean, obviously the punitive approach is like, get out of my class. You're going to go to the dean or whatever. You're going to get suspended, and I'm done with it, right? And the expectation of the punitive approach, the false expectation on the part of teachers and educators is like, I'm going to send you away to this other place, and something magical is going to happen there, and you're going to come back to me all better, and things will be different, right? Well, we know that's not true. There's usually not something magical that happens out there in the form of punishment and you come back all different. So you're going to do the same thing again and again. And I mean, I think that scenario is good because it brings up the what in the book I call preventative discipline, right? Which is really about relationship building. So my initial response to that is like, that wouldn't happen in my classroom because I will have built the relationship with students so that, I mean, maybe it will on day one, right? That's a different thing. But I think there's so much that goes into building relationships, building connections, creating the conditions so that those kinds of things don't happen in my classroom. So to avoid that, right? And so we could talk more about the relationship building piece because that's a whole different component. Mm-hmm. And it's still going to happen, right? And so I think the response, one of the most powerful tools that I learned as a young teacher was how to respond to students in the moment, right? So if that happens in my classroom, I know that is an out of the ordinary behavior. My response at first would probably be to, like my how I would want to respond is like, get the fuck out of my classroom. Who you think you're talking to, right? Mm-hmm. I would hopefully take a breath in that moment and not do that. And then I would respond to the student, are you okay? Right? Or what's going on with you? Because there's something happening with that student that's causing them to behave in this way that is totally out of their character, right? Or that's totally out of character for how you would behave in my classroom. So I think that in itself, in the moment, is a super powerful restorative response. Just simply questioning, are you okay? What's going on with you? This is kind of a tangent, but I just got done reading this incredible book by this woman, Valerie Kaur, called See No Stranger. And one of the things that I took from that book is the power of wonder. So she's talking on a much broader kind of political context, right? How do you approach people who have a fundamentally different political view than you, who maybe even don't fully believe in your humanity, right? And she talks about the power of starting with wonder. Beginning with wonder, I think is really powerful. So I would ask that question, right? And then I would get my class going, and then I would ask that student to step outside, right? And I would have a conversation with that student. Now, one of two things is going to happen, right? That student is still going to be in that emotional moment, and they might escalate. At which point, like, I'm actually not having that conversation right now because that's not going to be productive. So I would say, okay, cool, go have a seat, go sit in the office for a little bit, or go to the dean's office, whatever it is. Or that student is going to calm down, realize, right, that that's inappropriate in what they did, and probably apologize to me in the moment, at which point I'd say, cool, I appreciate your apology. You just said that in front of 25 other students. So what do you think needs to happen with that, right? And they might not be ready in the moment to come back in and apologize to the whole class, but at some point they're also going to take responsibility for that with the whole class, because they just call me out my name and my class out my name in front of the whole class, right? But even that, like walking back in with the student and the student seeing us like we're cool, they know something happened outside that shifted that dynamic. So I think that's super simple, but a really powerful restorative response. And so much of it is really shifting the power dynamic and the authority in the classroom, right? In the book, I talk about the difference between being an authority versus being an authoritarian, right? And authority is not given, it's earned, just like respect is not given, it's earned. And, this is, again, something else I'm sure we'll get into, but especially as a white man in a classroom with mostly students of color who don't have the same experiences that I have, it's on me to work really hard to earn that trust and earn that authority, because I'm sure much of their experience from previous however many years in school, they've had layers of negative and harmful experiences with educators who look like me, right? And so it's on me to earn that authority. And so, walking back, I think the fear oftentimes of teachers, well, I'm going to lose power, I'm going to lose authority in the classroom, right? But if I've earned that authority with the class, when I walk back in that classroom and they see that student and I, the student who just said whatever about my class is walking in and we're cool, their response is going to be like, oh, cool, something must have happened outside of that classroom where they've regained that respect, right? And they get that, as opposed to being like, oh, Gardner just got called out his name. How's he going to let that student come back to class, right? So I think it's that earned authority that allows that interaction to happen.
You mentioned your upbringing, and I want to touch on that. We can go through a bunch of school scenarios, and I think it will be useful for people. But you can also get his book and start there, and then reach out to him for some discussions or coaching or speaking if that's of interest to you. You grew up in California. Talk a little bit about your hometown, how you grew up, where you grew up.
Yeah, man. I grew up in Northern California in a small town called Ukiah, where my folks still live. And it's a small town, about 15,000 folks. And it is a very different place than Bayview Hunters Point, where I first started teaching at Thurgood Marshall and East Oakland. On some level, it was sort of like this chill small town, right? Like my upbringing, my childhood was easy and was pretty simple. And at the same time, I'm actually doing some more writing about this. There were a few chapters that I wrote that didn't go into Leading in the Belly of the Beast, that hopefully will be in a forthcoming book, but specifically interrogating and examining my upbringing and my whiteness and that impact on myself as an educator. So the way I talk about it is from this small town, I grew up in this kind of bubble of whiteness, right? Where as in most, small rural places in this country, it's just sort of the norm. And I didn't question it. I didn't know much outside of that. It just was what it was until I went to college and then started teaching, at which point my my level of racial consciousness was quickly raised. But I had the incredible fortune of having parents who I always tell people the most powerful gift they gave me was unconditional support. Right? I made choices, and sometimes I didn't agree, sometimes I pushed back against them, but ultimately when I made those choices, they got behind me and they supported me. And so it was a powerful gift for my life, because it's allowed me to do things like write a book. When I first got offered the book contract, I was like, write a book? I don't know what you're talking about. Right? So,
yeah, I have a few more questions about that. So shout out to Trevor's parents, because can I tell the story? When I was in high school, I wanted to go to a summer program. A caveat: all of Trevor's current students shouldn't think to ask Trevor this question, just so we don't tax his parents. But I wanted to go to a summer program in Chicago, and I had to raise money. And one of my first contributions came from Trevor's parents. They gave me a very generous donation to go to the summer program, and I was going into my senior year. It was the summer to my junior senior year. So shout out to them. I've never met them, actually, so we gotta solve that.
That was crazy. You never been up there. Yeah.
So unconditional support. What did they do for a living? Your parents do?
They're small business owners. So my folks own a scrap metal recycling business,
Got it.
Which is where I learned what really was when I was 15 in the summer of high school. And I was like working in the junkyard. No joke. So I was very clear. I'm staying in school. For my education. I'm not working here for my life.
You mentioned racial consciousness, like when you came into your racial consciousness. You went to UC Santa Cruz, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so talk about that. Talk about what that was.
Yeah, I mean, Santa Barbara is really a choice that was like geographically appealing, honestly, and I think like definitely the beginning of some awareness happened there. I started to get involved. There was definitely uh, an awareness by the time I got to college, and an awareness of my privilege and what I was given in the world, both racial and economic privilege, and some naive idealistic notion of wanting to do something in response to that, right? Wanting to give back. And so I started getting involved with some different nonprofits and student organizing down there. So that was, sort of like seeds were planted, but really it wasn't until I started teaching, and I graduated and moved to San Francisco and started teaching when I was 22, super young. So that's really when the sort of racial consciousness, I was confronted with my ignorance and all that I didn't know, and started to wake up. And actually the working chapter of one of the chapters I'm working on around leading as a white leader and being a white educator is there is no woke, right? There's no such thing as woke. There's only awakening, because I am reminded every day, all the time, that I don't know shit, right? And like I know some things and I'm learning some things, but I don't know shit, right? And so I think that's an important, like that humility and the awareness of that is super important. And so like I've been, this is year 21 in education, but every day there's still times where I'm like, oh damn, like how did I not know that, or how was I not aware of that?
Yeah, that openness and humility is important to keep, I think, at the top of mind for anybody as they're trying to improve and lengthen their craft. It's like, okay, I have expertise, I have experience to share, enough for like now a second book, right? But I'm still growing and learning. And you and I have talked several times about whiteness and the responsibility around like helping white people that are trying to get to a better place around, what their whiteness means for the context that they're working in. It's been elevated like 10 times since the murder of George Floyd. It's not an oldest conversation in schools, but it's like a new one, and several other new in a sense for people's willingness to take it on. And I told you straight up, like, I'm not doing that. I'm not helping. Like, we family, we cool, but I'm not helping white people. Like, it's not my job. You know what I'm saying? But like, what has been your experience, sort of in broad strokes, around connecting with other like white educators to talk about privilege?
I think for the most part, especially the schools that I'm working in, I have worked in schools, and I currently work in a school that very clearly has a stance around justice, and draws educators who, and we're in the Bay, right? So who come to the work because they want to do, on some level, justice work. And so I think for white educators in that space, there's definitely an openness and a leaning in. And it's been, and I think at the same time, an ongoing realization, like I said, of I didn't know what I didn't know, right? And I think that's why it's important for white folks to do this work with other white folks, right? Because it can be incredibly burdensome and harmful to folks of color to be a part of this sort of awakening and realization, right? When y'all are like, how did you not know that, right? So I think working with white educators, there's definitely an openness and a willingness, but folks are in everywhere across the spectrum in terms of their own, their own sort of development of racial consciousness. and what that means, both sort of looking at the mirror and looking through the window, right? So the reflective work of my identity and what it means to be a white educator in a space, but also looking out the window and having some analysis of systems, structures, history of racism and oppression. Um, and so even within a space of white educators, it's very different conversations and very different work. You know, we at my school, we actually are we're doing a whole school read of Bettina Love's "We Want to Do More Than Survive." This book about have you read it?
I haven't.
No. Okay. So you know, it's I think the bestseller in education right now, but it's this paradigm shifting book around what it means to be a student of color, and especially a Black student in our schools these days. And she talks a lot to and about white educators and what their responsibility is. And so, you know, we're in conversation. In fact, I did a book group with some of my teachers over the summer where we're digging into the book. And, you know, I think for the most part, folks are leaning in and are engaged in a way where they're like thirsty for this. And at the same time, you know, a little bit scared and intimidated and questioning, like, what does this mean? Like, this is actually, this work is different and is deeper and more challenging than, like, I don't know what I was getting myself into, right? So there's some of that as well. And I'm experiencing that, you know, like not just educators, right? So I have, you know, like some of my folks who I'm still connected with in Ukiah, white folks in Ukiah, I've been in conversation, kind of reaching out, right? And it's a similar response, right? Like, what do I do, right? Like just entering this conversation now.
Right.
And, you know, I think there's an initial leaning in, but I think the challenge is how do we push folks to understand this is not, you know, like it's being said all the time, it's not about reading a book. It's not about a book club, right? This is lifelong, deeply self-critical work that requires some level of self-sacrifice as well.
That's beautiful. How long have you been in school leadership?
I mean, I've been 21 years. This is my 21st year as an educator. 15 of those years were full-time classroom teaching. Mm-hmm. And then a couple of those years were sort of hybrid, mostly out of the classroom, but some teaching. In the last 5 years, I've been full-time out of the classroom as the director of teaching and learning at Arise.
Do you miss the classroom? Do you miss teaching?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I was one of those teachers who was super critical of folks who were leaving the classroom, whether you were leaving or becoming an administrator. Like, I'm never going to do that, right? I'm in the classroom. And I have mad respect for, you know, some of my most amazing mentors have been folks who have been, you know, like Robert Roth, or who I think was a teacher of yours, or Chuck Raznikov, folks from Thurgood Marshall who began and started 30, 35, 40 years in the classroom, which is incredible. So yeah, I miss it, and I have to work hard. You know, I have this set of leadership core values that kind of I've created to guide my work, and one of them is close to the classroom. So I work hard to, as much as possible, stay connected to the students in the classroom. At Arise, I've been co-teaching our leadership class for the last few years, so it's only like dipping my toe in. It's just a little bit, but it allows me to stay present and connected in the classroom.
Yeah, I was surprised to see that, you know, because we've obviously carried a friendship well beyond our time together, but I'm not unusual in your life around like staying connected to former students. Like you've kind of built this wide community of former students that you're still sort of like, you know, connected to, which I think is a beautiful testament to your commitment to the community that you serve and the people that come through, you know. It's difficult, man. Like seeing people, like I'm leaving the school, but I'm like never.
Yeah.
I'm like, I can't, I mean, I'm not in the classroom, right? I miss being able to connect with young people is dope. The work that I'm doing on the Board of Education is filled with a lot of different challenges that aren't, you know, that have nothing to do with the impact that needs to happen in the classroom. But with writing for you, like you are now building a larger community of other educators, right? Because these works, I think anybody that reads them will get some real insight into what it's like to teach in an urban setting if they're interested. But it's sort of focused, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, to be sort of like a guide for people in the work that are trying to like drive results or grow themselves. So you're building this wider community of educators. Do you feel like that makes it more challenging to stay connected to the school? Or are you like, how is that balancing for you?
I don't think I couldn't have written these books if I wasn't still in the work. And on a few levels, right? One, because I'm not a professional academic. I'm not a professional scholar, right? I don't have a PhD. I don't have a lot of letters. I haven't, like I've studied schooling and education and restorative justice and leadership as a practitioner. But I've never it's never been a full-time gig for me. Right. So, like I don't know, like reading my book is different than reading, a book written by a professor. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's, that has benefits and has limitations. But I just couldn't, I have this sort of constant imposter syndrome, right? When the first book, Discipline Over Punishment, came because an editor reached out to me and said, "Oh, I read this article in Kappa magazine. I really, I like what you had to say. Do you want to write a book?" Right. And my first response was like, "Hell no, who am I to write a book?" Right. I'm a teacher. That's what I do. Right. And she was like, "Well, try it, write a chapter and we'll see where it goes." And I wrote a chapter and it like flowed. And it's because I had 15 years of experience to write about. So I think that is fundamentally, and that, intentionally, in fact, you read in the introduction of the book, like it's Leading in the Belly of the Beast, the second book, we talk about it being by and for school leaders. So I didn't write the entire book. I edited the book. I wrote a few chapters in it. But there are 5 other school leaders that I was connected to in some way who also wrote chapters. And I was very intentional of reaching out to folks who were still current school leaders, because I've read a bunch of books about school leadership, very few of which were written by folks who are still currently in schools. And it's just different, right? In fact, as I was writing one of my chapters for Leading in the Belly of the Beast, I was like rewriting it as I went, because new stuff would come up and I'd be like, oh, actually, shifting my thinking and continually learning. And it's a different experience reading a book from that place. And I think people receive it in a different way. I know when I was a teacher, right, when I had some outside, facilitator who was a consultant come in who hadn't been in the classroom for 10 years, I was like, right? I was listening to it in a different way. And so I think that's what gives it its power. And none of the, I think 4 of the authors in the book, this is the first piece that they've published, right? So none of us are professional authors or academics. We're writing from a place of experience and literally just trying to gather from a practical and a theoretical perspective, like some of the struggles of school leadership.
No, I think that's what in part makes Pedagogy of the Oppressed and Bell Hook's book so powerful. Is at least in my, Pedagogy of the Oppressed is really dense, and you reference it as an influence for you, and even in the paragraph I read, there's like that influence is there. Let's talk a little bit about Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And then I want to. We don't have a lot of time left. I want to. Everyone knows now we're going to come back for an additional conversation, because I'm gonna dig deeper into the text, because I really want to elevate some of the lessons and kind of go back and forth on the ideas that Trevor writes in Leading in the Belly of the Beast with his co-authors and in Discipline Over Punishment. But do you remember when you first came across Pedagogy of the Oppressed?
Man, I don't know if this is when I first came across it, but probably when it really hit me is I helped found a school called East Oakland Community High School which was an OUSD school, talking about leading in the belly of the beast. That's a story to be told, right? It was a school that, small school that was started 2004 and only lasted 3 years. We were shut down after 3 years. And like I said, there's a whole story to that. But as part of that, I was part of, one way we did professional development was we broke into critical inquiry groups. And those critical inquiry groups met weekly and focused on whatever it was that they wanted to focus on. It was sort of different levels. And in fact, I know Jeff Duncan Andrade was on your podcast a while back. But he was one of the, I had the privilege of being in his critical inquiry group because he was a teacher at the school, along with like 5 or 6 other folks. And pedagogy was the first. I think we read the first few chapters of pedagogy. And I remember a few things, but I think the most fundamental is that sort of the shift in the paradigm of teaching around the banking model versus the problem posing model, right? That it wasn't about teachers who know everything, who are imparting knowledge on students, right? But about really students making meaning and teachers facilitating making meaning on their own.
Yeah, that's really the part that, like, the chapters on that are paradigm shifting. You used that phrase earlier in the conversation. When I was running Mission Bit, pedagogy of the oppressed was like required reading for all the college students before they started, So it's like, we teaching computer science, And I was like, yeah, everyone's reading pedagogy of the oppressed. And, everyone's reading Stereotype Threat by Claude Steele, or Whistling Vivaldi by Claude Steele. And everyone read, everyone watched Jeff Duncan Andrade's TED Talk on Roses and Concrete. It's like a 17-minute talk. And I'll put all those links in the description of below. So I just had, you may not remember her, Diana Liu, on the podcast. And, yeah. You remember? So we were talking about you because I don't know what the sequence of the releases is going to be, but we were talking about you because she's now a professional actress in LA.
All right.
And your camping trip is how Diana and I like met, right? So we were talking about her career, her journey, trying to like break into acting, and I was like, oh, I had no idea that's how we first started talking, and because I want to get into these like excursions you do with students and what that's looked like and how that's kind of changed over the course of the years. But when I was in high school, Trevor and a few other educators led I forget how many nights it was, like this overnight or a few overnight backpacking trip. And that trip is how I became close to my now best friend, Leonard D'Agostino. And I officiated Leonard's wedding. He and his wife, Patrice, have been married since 2013. But we built that bond over that camping trip that Trevor and his colleagues put together. And Diana Liu mentioned it also. That's how we became friends. So I know that's taken on a few different like phases, but talk a little bit about what you've done with that and why you've done it.
Yeah, man, that was an incredible. That was my first year at Thurgood. It was this thing called Intercession, where all teachers planned some sort of like week-long out of the classroom learning experience, and it was a real gift to have done and led that, because it was where I began to learn that what happens in the classroom is often like the least important thing, right? Or at least compared to all the possibilities of what could happen. And I remember that was it was Point Reyes, right? And 30 students, Point Reyes. It rained like crazy on us the second night. I remember y'all jumping up on the tabletops because there was raccoons out. It was hilarious. But it's definitely, I think, was the beginning of a foundation of understanding that teaching was not just about what happens in the classroom, right? So in the same way that you and Leonard connected, I feel like that experience for me with a lot of my students was like, oh, right. I started to see my students in a different way because we're a certain way in the classroom. And this is connected to the belly of the beast, right? For so many students, like you walk into a school building and you walk into a classroom and it's like the last place I want to be. And they're just layers of again, back to Bettina Love and that idea of spirit murdering, right? The experience of so many, what she calls dark students, right, is so layered with spirit murdering in a lot of spaces in school. And so, that was my first camping trip, but I started a backpacking club and did camping and backpacking trips my entire time at Thurgood. We would do 4 or 5 trips a year. And since then, I've been doing it every year. In fact, it evolved into my brother and I, about 15 years ago, we bought this piece of property up in Ukiah where my folks are at, where I grew up. And we've been taking students there several times a year just to like camp out and get out of San Francisco and get out of Oakland just for a different kind of experience. And one, it's beautiful and fulfilling for me, right? Like I love spending that time outside of the classroom with my students. But 2, it's so, in fact, I work really hard to get as many of my teachers as possible to go up there with us, and especially the teachers who are struggling with students with relationships, and even purposeful around inviting students who are struggling to connect with school or struggling to connect with students, because you get out there and it's just an entirely different experience. They get out there and they're like leading 8-mile hikes, right, up to Eagle Peak, or they're staring under the stars and teaching their peers about like the constellations, or they're the ones starting the fire, or they're cooking dinner, or whatever it is, right? And so you just get to see this fullness of their humanity that is so hard to see in the classroom, right? And so, yeah, man, that for me was like, oh, okay, like I see what this can do for relationship, and just for like, for us seeing each other's humanity, which is something that doesn't happen enough in a school building.
Yeah, that camping trip was, I read this book called Tribes. The author's first name is Sebastian. I forget his last name, but he talks a lot about in that book how hard things like strengthen bonds in ways that like it's like a fundamental part of people. Like we need that. We need like to struggle through something hard. And a lot of his work is focused on like how veterans miss these like awful battle conditions because of the people they were connected to when they went through it. Not to say that your cabin trip is like a war zone, but those 8-mile hikes for teenagers, because I complained my ass off. I complained every day.
3 miles uphill with a 30-pound pack on for sure. I mean, I think it's that like struggle brings us together. I think it's also folks like to shine, right? They like to be successful. And I mean, imagine students who just aren't good at school, who struggle academically. You spend 7 hours a day, 5 days a week, not feeling affirmed, right? Not feeling successful. And so, damn, like how does that impact you emotionally, psychically, right? Like spending all day, every day. And they do this shit every day, right? They come to school and they just like, and they do it, right? And, like I was fortunate to be good at school, and that wasn't my experience, right? My son struggles, like he doesn't love school. He struggles academically. He's brilliant and beautiful and like empathetic, and like he's just this incredible soul. But I know his experience with school is not often feeling successful. And so, imagine those students who day after day, they go through the day and they're probably trying hard, right? Or at some point they tried hard, or at some point in the day they're trying hard, they're not feeling successful. Damn, like that's a lot. That's a heavy load to carry day after day. And so they got to shine. They got to feel successful. We have to find spaces and find ways to affirm them. And so like I said, getting out of the classroom, being on these trips. And it was important for me, like, oh, damn, this student who like I struggle with, like, I don't know how to help them be successful in my class. They get out there and it's like, whoa, they are shining and successful in this totally different way that I had no idea about.
Yeah, that's a whole dimension. I'm glad we touched on that. I'm glad I remembered that. I didn't want to bring that up, but I would, because that's a whole other dimension of, it's the relationship, stupid. One of the titles of your a chapter in your book. I'm gonna close out with a rapid fire question round. We're going to do a part 2 because I'm going to get more excerpts. And
No, man, that was an hour.
But for now, you ready for the rapid fire round?
I think so.
Okay. Do you meditate?
No. I do. I go on daily walks in the morning. I wake up at 5:30 every morning and I go on a walk for a half hour. So it's a form of meditation.
Do you have a motto?
Discipline yourself so that no one else has to.
What personal weakness can you forgive in someone?
What personal weakness can I forgive in someone? Not knowing what you don't know.
What's one book you would recommend?
Ooh, so right now I got 2. I got all right, Discipline Over Punishment by Trevor Gardner, Leading in the Belly of the Beast by 6 incredible educators. But man, you got to read this book, See No Stranger by Valerie Kaur. It's just like heart and body, and it's beautiful. It's it's one of those ones that's like I want everybody in the world to read because it will change you.
Last final question. Okay. Second one, go ahead.
I said after Discipline Over Punishment.
All right. Okay. Last final question. Who's going to win the presidential election?
Woo-wee. Barack Obama.
Okay. There you go. This was Trevor Gardner, 2-time author, Discipline Over Punishment, Leading in the Belly of the Beast, Dean of Students at Arise High School, family member of mine, community and family member to many, father, educator, dope person. Thank you, Trevor.
So good to be here. Love you, Stevon.
Peace, peace. And thank you for listening to another episode of Cook on Monday Morning. At Cook on Monday Morning, we believe that if you can own Monday morning, you can own the week. If you can own the week, you can own the year. And if you change your year, you can change your life. I'd like to thank Trevor again for being a guest this week. His ongoing commitment to the classroom and to schools has always deeply moved me. I know I'm not alone. And gratitude for having had him as a teacher and now having a friendship as men. It's a true testament to his ongoing commitment to the community and improving at the craft of being an educator. Please check out his books, get them as gifts for the educators that you know. If you're interested in having a conversation with him directly about the books, email me, info@stevoncook.com, and I can connect the two of you. I'd like to thank our most recent YouTube subscribers, Diana Liu. She was last week's guest. Thank you, Diana. Stacy Browick and Sarah Bobo. Deeply appreciate your support. Please follow these folks' lead and subscribe to Cook on Monday Morning on YouTube. If you enjoyed the podcast, also share it with a friend. We are a small listening audience, but we are growing week by week, and it's because you are sharing the good discussions that we're having on this platform. So Cook on Monday Morning is a product of the Luther Harris Holding Company. It is a boutique consulting practice that focuses on building strategic partnerships between businesses and government, recruiting diversity talent to leadership roles, and helping companies drive impact in the communities that they do business in. So if you'd like to learn more about any of that, feel free to email me. It is info@stevoncook.com. We are week by week getting closer and closer to releasing merchandise. It's a great way to support our message of peace, productivity, love, and of course, making the decision to own Monday morning. We want to create intention about improving ourselves and improving our community. Be the first to purchase some of the merchandise by subscribing to my newsletter at stevoncook.com. We are only releasing a limited amount of pieces, so they are going to sell out. Subscribe to the newsletter to make sure you get your hands on one. Finally, I'd like to thank our listeners once again. I deeply appreciate you. I'd like to thank also the people that make this podcast possible, our videographer, David Topete, and our copy editor, Fernando Encico Marquez. So I get up every Monday morning with the intention to create value and showcase my love to the people that keep our cities moving. They are our teachers, school lunch workers, custodians, social workers, firefighters, police officers, EMT workers, garbage collectors, bus drivers, and nurses. They are our employers, the folks creating jobs and keeping our economy growing and moving. And they are our gig workers, the folks that are stocking our shelves, driving our ride shares, delivering our food to all of you. This podcast is for you. Until we meet again next week, peace, and we out.